Hey, what's up, y'all? It's Sunday, and I kind of just wanted to have a general conversation, not so much focused on the Browns as much as it is focused on the NFL, sports in general, and how things evolve in sports that we can be very, very bad at predicting. When I say we, yeah, YouTubers, sports analysts of the kind, but also, just everybody is kind of bad at this, right? And what got me thinking about this is, whenever you have a jump in viewers, you also have a jump in people going through your back catalog and going, boy, this aged poorly, right? Because, I put out videos every day. Some of it ages great. Some of my stuff is aged great, and some of my stuff has aged awfully, right? Some of my most popular content has aged awfully, right? It doesn't mean that it's any less worthy or that I regret putting it out there, because I can't be right 100% of the time. And I don't do this to be right. I do this to just talk about how I'm feeling at the time. And that got me thinking, why do so many sports takes age poorly? And I think the reason why sports takes when it comes to the future in general age poorly is because I think we as human beings, when we talk about the future, we are not ever able to imagine a future outside the conventions of our own times, right? If you go to a book written in the 1920s, or not 1920s, in like the 1800s, where people were still riding horses instead of the motor vehicle, and they write about what they think 100 years in the future is going to be, it's going to be like some kind of mobilized version of a horse instead of a completely new machine, right? We're not able to imagine the car because the car is not in our conventional timeline yet. Like, we just haven't thought of that thing. So what we can think of is a better horse. The car eventually was the better horse, but we just think of the better horse as literally a better horse. Right? Like, that's where we get stuck into when we start to try to predict the future as human beings. And this definitely goes into football, and it goes into sports in general, right? In football, let's go back to the days where, and this might surprise some people, right? Because this thing has done a complete 180. But to the younger viewers in the audience, there was a day where running backs were looked at as important, if not much more important than a quarterback, right? One of the most expensive trades in history was for a running back, right? The Ricky Williams trade, where he literally traded, where Mike Ditka, I think, traded his whole draft for Ricky Williams, right? A running back, which is absurd. It's absurd now to talk about a running back going in the top 15, let alone trading up everything to get into the top 5 to draft a running back. But there was a day where that wasn't the normal, right? Where if you traded for a star running back, you were giving up 3 first-round picks. Like, you were paying quarterback prices for running backs. Running backs got the money. Running backs got the long-term deal. And then all of a sudden, they didn't, right? I mean, the Ricky Williams trade was what? Close to the 2000s? So not that long ago. I mean, like 20 years ago, but not that long ago. And now we're at a point to where Nick Chubb is the best running back in football, and people are questioning whether his money is going to be worth it. The same thing with Derrick Henry, who is a generational talent at the position. We have gone from a point of running backs are irreplaceable, and you pay them essentially as if they are the franchise. I mean, the Jim Brown era was key in bringing that in to, hey, we'll just draft the running back in the 3rd round. That's how far the running back, from face of the franchise, the most irreplaceable player on the roster was the running back, to, just the guy, right? That's where we have gone with the running back conversation, right? Let's talk about another thing where the league changed and nobody could understand it. Ray Lewis was a dog at Miami. He was clearly going to be a good player coming out. But everybody talked themselves, well, not everybody, but enough teams talked themselves out of Ray Lewis to where the Ravens could get him with their 2nd first-round pick that they had in that draft. It kind of reminds you of another undersized linebacker in JOK. Not saying JOK is going to be Ray Lewis, but they both fell in the draft for similar reasons, right? Ray Lewis was undersized. Now, he was 250. Well, he was like 235, I think, coming out of college. 6 foot, so really just the same size as JOK is. But people could not get past that he was not 6'5" in 250 because that's what a linebacker was back then, right? And that inability to look past that convention forced teams to take worse players at that position. Think about Aaron Donald, right? Aaron Donald was a player who tested off the charts. The tape was incredible. I remember it was in college. Me and my friends used to get draft boards for fun because this is the kind of thing you do for fun in college sometimes when you're not like going out. And we would have these draft boards. I remember telling everybody on my dorm room, if you lived with me in Kilcawley House at Youngstown State University in 2014, you probably would know. I would tell everybody who was interested that Aaron Donald was the best player in that draft. And people would hit me with the, oh, well, he's small. He's a defensive tackle. How impactful could he be? I didn't care. I thought the brother could play football and it didn't matter where you put him, right? And I think that's the most important skill set for players, if you could play football or not. And he could play football at Pitt. He was dominant. Go look at that Pitt tape and tell me he wasn't the best player in that draft. And then Aaron Donald comes out. He goes 14th overall. However, I think he went 14th or 15th. I think the Rams had like literally back-to-back picks that year. They draft him, and he turns out to be one of the greatest defensive players of all time. But a bunch of teams passed on Aaron Donald. The Browns included twice, by the way, that the fourth, and then they traded back to the eighth, and they ended up with Justin Gilbert. Shout out Ray Farmer and Mike Pettin for that decision. But by the way, they drafted Justin Gilbert without even interviewing. Let me not get into that. But they missed out on Aaron Donald because they couldn't get past the conventions of their time. They looked at Aaron Donald not as a football player. They looked at him as a defensive tackle, as a guy who was small for the position, as a guy who could not play three technique in the NFL because that's the only thing that you could draft a player to play as, is the position that he's listed at as the depth chart. You could not see past that convention, which caused a lot of people to be wrong. We can even do a cross sport one, right? Let's look at basketball. Whenever we talk about big men in basketball, what's been the conversation before Giannis won the championship, right? When Giannis won the championship, that kind of changed things. But before Giannis won the championship, the conversation was, what has happened to the big man in the NBA? Oh my goodness, there are no big men in the NBA. Everything small ball. Keeping in mind, right, that this is at an era where LeBron James is dominating at 6'8", 277 pounds, where Giannis is out here at 7 foot, where Kevin Durant is the scoring champ back to back at 7 foot. James Harden, bigger than Charles Barkley, doing what he's doing. And the conventions of the time, right, limited our vision of the future because we were literally looking at the future and saying, oh, these big men have disappeared when the big men had just evolved, right? 7-footers can now dribble, shoot, pass, create. Look at Joel Embiid. I mean, that dude's freaky, right? Like, the conventions of our time limit us. Mobile quarterbacks is another one I want to get on, right? Where I was watching this video. It was in 2012, right before Andrew Luck was about to go number 1 overall. And there was a huge conversation because the year before, Cam Newton went number 1 overall about who would have the better career. Now, Cam Newton, for multiple reasons, ended up having the better career, Super Bowl appearance, MVP. You can argue that you think Andrew Luck had more potential, but when it comes to just their career, what they actually did, Cam Newton ultimately did much more. So Cam was ultimately going to be the one better at that. But what caught me by surprise when I was watching that video was how fixated people were on Cam's mobility and how he used mobility in his game and how they just, and it still happens today with Lamar Jackson, how people just could not see past the convention of their time, right? Because at that time, only pocket passing quarterbacks had won Super Bowl. Like maybe Steve Young, he won 1 Super Bowl and people said his mobility got in the way, right? But only pocket passers were Super Bowl champions back then, right? That was before Russ had won his title. That was before Pat Mahomes had won his title and countless other mobile quarterbacks have, well, quote unquote, mobile quarterbacks and won the roster. I mean, the Super Bowl that we were saying that. But that was the line at the time. Like people thought that if your quarterback could run, it was a negative because you can't win with a quarterback like that. Like people actually thought that because people were stuck in the conventions of their time. They could not see past a world where pocket passing quarterbacks were the only option. And now we live in a world where if your quarterback can't scoot, he ain't worth nothing, right? Like, it is interesting to see where when Big Ben entered the league, right, in 2004, he was a mobile quarterback, right? He was seen as mobile because he could get out the pocket and he could scramble a little, and he wasn't a statue. Big Ben was seen as a mobile quarterback. I remember the days where Big Ben was a mobile quarterback. And by the time he left the league, the man was the most immobile dude in the NFL. His play style hadn't changed. It was just that the league evolved around him, right? Aaron Rodgers, same way. People used to look at him as a mobile guy. Now he's a pocket passer, right? The only pure pocket passer that's really left, I would say, is what? Tom Brady, maybe Matt Ryan, right? Like, those are the guys from the last era. But other than that, like a dude like Baker Mayfield, if he was drafted in, like, let's say 2009, would be seen like Tony Romo. Because Tony Romo was a scrambler. He ran like a 5.2 240, but people saw Tony Romo as a scrambling quarterback. Like, that's how little it took for you to be a scrambling quarterback. All you had to be back in the day was willing to run, and you were a scrambling quarterback. And now, it's not the same. You're not seen as mobile unless you run a sub 4.7, right? Other than that, you're a statue. And that's how the conventions of how we evaluate quarterbacks has changed. It's why Lamar Jackson went 32nd, because we could not see past the conventions of our time. And now I see this coming up with defensive line positions. In linebacking, let's just say front seven positions. I see this popping up now where there's a group of people who think the game has gone positionless there, and I think they're right. And then there's a group of people who are stuck in the conventions of their time, right? We live in a world where, maybe my generation is the first to do this. I'm not sure. But I know that when I talk about defensive tackles, I don't usually talk about 4-3 defensive tackle, 3-4 defensive tackle. I talk about 0 techs, 1 techs, 3 techs, 4-eye, 4 out, all of those like defensive line chart positions, because I don't think the scheme dictates what the player can do now as much as it did in the past. But there are people now who look at this scheme and think that dictates how the player has to be built. And we're seeing this because I saw people write some articles talking about there are not a lot of great 3 techs in this year's draft because of some weight and size issues. And to me, the defensive line is positionless. The ideal that you have to be 300 pounds to line up at 3 tech is gone, right? We now live in a world where Jadeveon Clowney and Myles Garrett, they switch out to 3 tech all the time in games, right? They play 3 tech all the time. Myles Garrett plays 3 tech all the time. Sometimes you'll put somebody who is 245 pounds at 3 tech to get the mismatch on a guard who's not quick enough to handle a smaller player like that, right? The conventions of our time have changed when it comes to defensive line. So now when you have guys coming out that are smaller, lighter, quicker, but not stronger, people freak out. Oh, there's never been a player that's like that that's ever been successful, right? Just like there's never been a player quite like Lamar Jackson that had won MVP, but then it happened, right? Just because you're not able to see outside the conventions of your time does not mean that things cannot change, because they will change. They absolutely will change. And that's where the next move is going. Defensive line positions specifically are now positionless, right? If you could draft somebody at edge, they're really just a defensive lineman, which means they can line up anywhere, right? The ideal of having a dedicated 0 tech on your roster, right, where you used to be able to exist on the NFL roster because you were 6'6" and 370 pounds and you could do this, right? Like, that used to be a position in the NFL, right? 6'6", 370, you got some long enough arms and you can go in a 3-4, right? That's literally your job, right? 2 arms out, don't move. That's all you had to do, right? There were some linebackers back in the day. Look at the Ravens. They're a key example of that, whose job was to just run into people, right? Who's just clear space so the small guy can get through. That used to be people's jobs. The game has evolved. Those dudes don't exist. The game is more skilled. You can't just exist for being a certain size and weight in the defensive line, and now you have to be more skilled. And what we're seeing now, and I'm going to say this now, and look, this might age like milk. We talked about it in the beginning of this video. Takes age like milk because we're bad at predicting the future here. But I think this is going to be one of the most dynamic defensive line classes in the interior that we have seen in quite a while. And I think people are failing to see that because they cannot see past the conventions of their time. And I think in a couple of years, we will change. Just like how now, because of Darius Leonard, a guy like JOK could be seen as a prototypical linebacker. Maybe because of some players in this draft, we're going to look at other players in other drafts differently. But that's just what I wanted to talk about, is why takes age like milk. And I think a big part of it is when we talk about the future, we are bad at seeing past the conventions of our own times, right? It's true. Like, think about Back to the Future. We thought that flying cars would exist, right? Because we're used to cars and cars fly. Now we have drones. See what I mean? We can't see past the convention of our time sometimes, and that limits our creativity and our ability to predict the future. So what do you think in the comment section is going to be a new wave in the NFL? What do you think is going to change the league? What position do you think that we look at now in some stringent way is going to change? Let me know in the comment section down below. But again, guys, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Have a good night.